Hey, welcome everyone. You have tuned in once again, I hope, to the Alabama Take series Short Takes. I'm your host, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Alabama Take. That's my fancy title that I gave myself. My name is Blaine Duncan. If you're just joining us for the first time by chance, Short Takes is a brief talk show with an artist, writer, painter, you name it. We limit ourselves to only 4 questions once we get the ball rolling. And as you may know by now, that 4th question is always the same for everyone. With me today, though, he's a writer. He's an instructor at the University of Alabama. He's a football, basketball, donut, track jacket, cologne aficionado. He's a poet. He's a runner. He's a DJ. He's an Instagram and Twitter persona. I'm going to run out of breath. He's a jack of many trades and so many trades. And he is such a great guy. Mr. Brian Oliu is here with us today. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Blaine, how are you? Thank you so much for having me and for that fantastic introduction. I will try my best to live up to it, though, as you know, it's a lot of titles, right? It's a lot of monikers, and so it's hard to live up to one of them, if not all of them. But I'm going to try to do my best.
So before we begin, I'm going to give you a bit of a stage with just a few things to let everybody catch up with you as well. So tell me about what you've been up to. What works do you have going and on the horizon that you can mention here?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny. I just received. I have a book coming out. I have 2 books coming out. One is a book on professional wrestling. It's called Body Drop, and so that's coming out through the University of North Carolina Press, and so that's going to be out in the fall. And the subtitle is Notes on Fandom and Pain in Professional Wrestling. So it's a kind of personal memoir. I keep coming back to this idea. I was talking with a friend of mine who, they kept asking, I write about, pop culture and things like that. And people are like, oh, are you like a scholar of these things? And I was like, and his answer was always like, I'm not a scholar, I'm a fan. And so I think they asked him, this is my buddy, Jason McCall.
Oh yes. Love Jason.
Yeah, he's great.
Hey, Jason.
And so they asked, yeah. And so they asked him at his like MFA thesis where they're like, are you a scholar of poetry now? And he was like, no. He's like, but I'm a fan of poetry. And so that's what I keep coming back to, especially in terms of that. It's like, oh, are you going to learn every possible thing about professional wrestling through this book? The answer is no. But, you're going to kind of learn about my fandom and kind of what I find appealing about it and kind of those deeper looks into the kind of interesting nuances to it. So, I'm super excited about that. I just got some book covers to look at and pour over, which is always a super exciting day.
That's the exciting time, yes.
Yeah, so that's one of the best days of the book writing process. So I am very excited about that. I'm looking forward to kind of go over that. And then my other book, I mentioned Jason McCall, we have a book of poems coming out about the Rocky film franchise. And so that's going to be, we did a collaboration together where we kind of wrote poems back and forth, which was really fun. So that we did that last 2 poetry months ago. So I mentioned, I think we were talking beforehand about National Poetry Month. It is National Poetry Month. It's April, at least when we're recording this. That'll be coming out, I think this summer. So that'll be out actually before the wrestling book. And I'm excited to do that. And, kind of hopefully we'll be in a position where we'll be able to do some promos for that. We'll be able to kind of have some readings together, kind of bounce around Alabama a little bit and do that. We both love Rocky. And so we decided let's kind of get together and write some poems about the whole series. Those are kind of the main things kind of on the horizon, at least in terms of creatively. And, as always, there's the book gets finished, you have to do that work, but then there's always the work of writing the book. So that are different books. So that's pretty fun. So
Jason's a great writer. His poems are really moving. So
they're phenomenal.
That's exciting to find out. And also I've known your work to be poetry and then also this lyrical blend of prose and poetry. Is the wrestling book more narrative this time?
So it's a combination. Kind of the way in which the book is structured, there are highly lyric things, and they're usually kind of about, the lyric pieces are about wrestlers in particular. And so that's kind of what's being utilized there, which is pretty fun. And then there's another narrative that's a little bit more explanatory, a little bit more straightforward, that kind of talks about my own kind of interactions with wrestling, kind of my own kind of feelings about my own body, etc., kind of being a fan. And so there's and then there's like some small sections which are like spot calls. If people like watch wrestling, like sometimes wrestlers will talk to one another about, okay, clothesline, okay, go to finish. And so there's little sections of that in there as well, which almost serve like little poems. So there's a bunch of kind of cool things that operate within there. So yeah, it's a kind of a hybrid of all those things kind of put together, kind of the extravagant element of wrestling, kind of the performative aspect kind of has this highly lyric piece to it. And then there's like the down and dirty, which is a little bit more straightforward narrative. So there's kind of a fun balance between those two.
That's exciting. I've always wondered your history with wrestling, so I will save it for the book. I will read it in the book.
Yeah.
All right. So when can we see a return of Idiot Man? Does he have takes on baseball? What are his origins, by the way?
Okay, so Idiot Man kind of came about. The origins of Idiot Man are actually pretty fun. So when I was a graduate student at Alabama, we started a flag football league, and it wasn't even a league, right? It was like a bunch of us getting together to play flag football. And so we play on Saturdays, and you just like trying to let people know that we're in the department, like, hey, we're playing flag football on Saturdays. And so they just turned into these like massive, like ridiculous emails that I would write, and kind of from this persona of Idiot Man / like the commissioner. And so I kind of went and took upon this mantle of that, and I just send these out to like, it would just be like these, 900 word, more than 900 words. At some point they were like 2,000 word emails that I'd send every week. And then at the end it would be like, we're playing on Saturday at 10. Like, it's just kind of like this kind of performance thing. And I did get kicked off the listserv for them and then like brought back on. And it was kind of this whole ordeal. So it took on this life of its own. And so I started, I sent it to McSweeney's, which was, the humor website. And this was a long time ago. And I sent them one of the emails and they were like, we like this, but we're going to pass. And they're like, send something else. And so I sent them another one and I got an email back and I'll remember it's just like, how many of these do you have? And I was like, a lot. Like I've sent like 30 of these emails. And so they're like, we'll take all of them. So I was like, all right. So I just kind of, they rejected the one, but they were more interested in like the collective. And so that was kind of the origins. And so even to this day, they'll still post links every once in a while that it's like emails to the English department listserv regarding the English department flag football league. And so there's a series on McSweeney's that are a result of that. So that's the birth of Idiot Man. And then I just decided to kind of write once I was asked to like write about sports. Friends of ours kind of started like a blog. This was a couple years ago, and it's hard for me to write about sports without getting very excited and kind of like over the top. And I'm like, well, there's so much sports commentary and so much sports conversation that happens that's just the same. And so I said, well, what if I kind of ramp up this Idiot Man persona and it's someone who's just like, we adopted a greyhound, Summer the Greyhound, and she's this perfect angel. She's just walking there right now. She's this perfect angel of a dog that like she was trained to be a racing greyhound. So she's she's a people pleaser. She just wants to like help and she doesn't want to do anything bad, but her prey drive is through the roof. Right. And so she's someone that like, she's just like, if she sees a cat, she like everything short circuits and she just like freaks out and wants to go after the cat. So to me, I'm like, this is the perfect metaphor for Idiot Man. Here's somebody who's like he presents himself as very well read and very astute and someone who like has all this weird arcane knowledge, but he can't help but like just freak out over football. Right. Yeah. And so he's like that's kind of my mentality. And so like someone getting very excited and using all this like bizarre language and bizarre way of talking about it. So that was kind of how Idiot Man came to be. And kind of the crafting of that.
The impetus of that actually fascinates me even more. And it's also great to see the Idiot Man persona pop up because it's a signal to me that football's either near or we're in the midst, and I'm pumped for that too. So
yeah, no, absolutely, it's fun. It kind of was a nice tradition to kind of because it gets me excited too, and allows me to kind of like, it's game week. Let me kind of get my weird thoughts on what the heck's going on. So
Great. Yeah. So before we get in the show proper, why don't you tell the audience about your short poem production that you're doing on Instagram and where they can find that?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So I decided, it's funny, I've mentioned National Poetry Month. I decided for 2021, I was like, well, I'm going to do one poem a day every day this year. And I said I want them to be 4 lines, a maximum essentially of 4 lines. I think I wrote a couple 3-line poems. And I was like, well, I need more than that. I was like, well, we'll kind of make them Tuscaloosa based. And so that was my idea. So there's an Instagram account. It's called Tiny Tuscaloosa. And so it's, Instagram.com/Tiny Tuscaloosa. And so, yeah, I write little 4-line poems. They're little things, just kind of usually reactions to kind of what's going on at the day. So usually some things that are hyper-local, some things less local. I find myself writing about the weather a lot because the weather of obviously in West Alabama is bizarre. And so that's kind of the thing that's constantly on my mind. So it's been really fun. It's a nice thing for me to do, either to like end my day if I'm up late, like if it's midnight, okay, let me write my poem for the day, or late at night or something along those lines, able to kind of do small little reactionary poems to things. Let's say if something happens, I'm able to kind of say, oh, this is something that's going on today, right? Whether it's a sporting event at Alabama. I should today or yesterday, I guess I should have written about the giant elephant statue that's being installed in front of the stadium. He might get a poem. He might get a poem tomorrow. That might be my poem for tomorrow.
Cool. Deservedly so. So if you're watching this, you're probably watching, you can go back on April 14th, 15th, and maybe spot a poem about the big elephant, our new elephant in front of the stadium.
Yeah, now I'm going to have to do it. So yeah, it'll be the 14th. Yes, your poem on the 14th will be about the elephant.
Awesome. You ready for your 4 questions?
Let's do it. I'm ready.
Let's dive in. So you're known for your positivity. At least I know you for your positivity. You spread love, joy, humor, really good advice online. How do you manage to maintain that feeling and attitude in a day-to-day life? And do you, I guess, is maybe the better question. Do you maintain, like, when the computer's off, when the phone's down, and it's you, the wife, the Greyhound? I mean, is that still the same Brian that they see?
It is. Wow. It's funny because we mentioned, I talked about wrestling. It kind of works out. It's like, okay, it's persona, right? There's still kind of this element of a persona where, everyone has an online persona, whether they're aware of it or not, right? Like,
I agree with that.
It is, this is how I decide to type, even just things and saying like, oh, this is the punctuation I use.
Yes.
Maybe I won't use this word. We as we craft our persona, because this is kind of what we see. And so I'm aware of that. I'm hyper aware of that. I think it's one of those things that I'm very much aware of my audience. And so I always kind of think of my audience because of my role of an educator, I think of like, okay, my audience is always going to be kind of college students, right? Like, what in these kind of like little things and kind of what am I going to get away with, or how do I present myself as somebody who is kind of, I have information that needs to be presented, or say, here's something I care deeply about. How do I acknowledge that I care deeply about this thing, was still kind of representing this kind of role, right? So for me, I would say, yeah, I am that positive. Not to say that I don't, like, sometimes it's turned up a little bit. Like I lovingly love to use exclamation points online. I'm a big exclamation point guy. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily an exclamation point guy in real life. But, so I do love doing that. So that's kind of my mentality and kinds of crafting it. What is kind of interesting, I think, for me, especially this past year, and something I've worked on a lot, is sometimes like I try to back away from like toxic positivity, right?
That's yes.
Which is hard, right?
So define that for me, who sometimes that's fuzzy for me. So tell me what that exactly would be for you, toxic positivity.
So toxic positivity would be like something like, let's say someone doesn't get a job, right? So let's say someone doesn't get a job. sometimes the thing that you don't want to hear is like, oh, everything's going to be great. Just forget about it. You're amazing. Blah, 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 blah. Kind of like, because it sounds like you're not necessarily hearing that person, right?
Gotcha.
And so, sometimes it's just like, oh, don't worry about it, whatever, kind of passing on this kind of element of toxic positivity. There are better examples, but that's the first one that kind of popped into my head.
At first, I thought it was maybe like a hint of disingenuous persona or attitude.
I think so too, and I think because I think, or the same way it can seem very dismissive.
I got you.
Let's say, actually, a great example I think is obviously if something like Black Lives Matter in terms of somebody expressing their, let's say it's a person of color, expressing their hurt in a certain way, right? Like, here's how the system has failed me, so on and so forth. And for someone to come be like, you know what, talk about the positive things, look on the bright side of this stuff, like that type of thing. And that you'll see, it's like, well, if we just we should all get along. We'll see good in each other's heart. And that's what really matters. And it's like, well, okay, but you're not listening to what this person's saying, right?
Exactly.
And so that you kind of recenter, the experience upon you as opposed to upon the other person, right? So that's something that I've kind of had to work on, in certain ways, like where, I'm always somebody who tries to fix things, right? That's just kind of in my nature. I always want to help out. I always want to fix. I always want to kind of, if someone's upset, I want to make them not upset, right? I'm like, okay, what can I do, right? And sometimes there isn't anything you can do. And so sometimes, instead of providing those suggestions, countless suggestions, be like, oh, this is how this will do this. Sometimes you just got to sit with that person, right? And be like, this sucks, right? Like, I acknowledge the fact that this situation is terrible, and then kind of move on from there. So that's something that I kind of have had to kind of check myself on, and because it's in my nature to want to help. It's been my nature to be positive and be like, hey, you're going to be all right. This is good. But to be able to kind of hear and acknowledge those things has been something that I've worked on personally. I was trying to think in terms of myself, I do get upset, right? I do get crabby. The things that do kind of make me upset, I guess, I don't like my time doesn't feel valued. That's kind of a thing that I kind of get upset about. Or I think it's funny, especially confirmation bias elements of looking into zodiac signs, right? I'm a very, very straightforward Sagittarius. And one of the things they said about Sagittarius is like what makes you angry. And the thing that spoke to me most is when someone asks for your advice and then doesn't take it, that's something that makes me very upset. So if someone
that can make me really upset too. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that one, but yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned that we have personas online, because you kind of reminded me that I'm a little bit too much of a smartass online, and maybe I should check that and be more not toxic like you talk about. I love that example. Yeah, that's good not to be aware of not doing that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, for example, I kind of took a step back, I think, especially online persona, where another thing that makes me upset, I think, is when people are mean for the sake of being mean, right? Yes. Or kind of doing something that's obviously in bad faith, right? I know I can recognize that pretty quickly, whether it's I'm a very liberal leftist person. I can recognize what a conservative viewpoint is, and I can observe when someone's trying to troll me. And I don't like that. And so as a result of that, I kind of find myself disengaging from those types of things, those kind of disgenuine moments. That's kind of where, but I think I had moments, I think, especially over the past couple of months, because it's been hard, that I found myself being a little bit more snarky than I normally am. And I was like, I don't like that. I don't like feeling that way. So that's kind of those moments where I found myself, okay, I need to disengage a little bit, because I don't like kind of that way I'm presenting myself, and the way it's also making me feel, where I'll put down my phone and and be like, oh, I'm mad about what this person said online, and I'll kind of stew over that. I'm like, what am I doing, right? There's no reason for me to kind of stew over that. So that's kind of been an adjustment for sure. But
gotcha,
yeah.
So you mentioned being an educator. You talked about
that.
Well,
I do.
I have this is a question I saw you almost sort of answer on one of your Instagram stories. So I'm going to present it to you here. what are some of the major errors of the education system, and what can we do about them? Because I too am an educator,
Yes.
and that's no secret to probably the people who listen and watch. So what do you think? Major errors, are there fixes?
I think for me, it's hard because it's so easy to obviously, come up with, here's what's wrong, and then like being like, who's to fix it? Who's to say, right? But and so it's hard to kind of put that thing. But I think the thing I keep coming back to about it is kind of like two things, right? One is the perception of what the education system is, and I think like. It's a very dated perception, right? We all want to we kind of project, and I say we, right? Let's say older folks, right? Like as an example, whether it's a baby boomer or someone even who's gone through high school, gone through college, gone through elementary school, middle school, etc.
You can say boomer. I don't think they watch.
Okay, yes, I don't know if they know the tech, right? So, yes, the boomers. But I mean, I'm not just the people who act very boomer, right? Even if you're, my age, right, or younger.
Of course.
I'm not to vilify everyone who's above the age of, 50, whatever. But I think like what winds up happening is we try to like transpose our educational experience upon the current educational experience. And obviously things have shifted, right? So like, I mean, one of the common complaints that I always hear as an English teacher, if I run into somebody, they're like, oh, these kids don't know grammar anymore.
Yes.
And I'm like, yeah, grammar is elitist and it's nonsense and it's racist and we shouldn't worry about grammar, and the English language has evolved and continues to evolve, and we don't talk the same way we used to even 10 years ago. So why would I teach these like strunk and white antiquated concepts, right? Like so like, but at that point it's appalling. And so I think it's that kind of projection, or even for you, like I think you have folks running into, it's like, oh, these kids, something always pops up online where it's like, these kids don't know what like the Berlin Wall was, and these kids don't know these basic American facts, and it's like, well, yeah, because we're beyond that, right? Like education is less. The problem is, I think we continue to kind of perceive education, or lots of people perceive education as a commodification, right? It's a big commodification of learning where we're like, we're into like the freer like banking model, right? Where it's like, I am a teacher, I have information, you come, I give you this information, I deposit this information into you, and then this transaction happens. Like I have something, you do not have this thing. Therefore I'm going to give it to you, right? And so I think like that perception of education is what's kind of like driving a lot of this anti-education rhetoric that we hear, especially if we've heard we've been hearing this forever, but especially during the pandemic, because it's still perceived as, oh, this teacher is not bestowing this information upon these students in their Zoom meetings because these students are not retaining it. It's like, well, that's because it's, what inherently winds up happening in these like banking models is students become passive to their own education, right? You sit back, you wait for the lecture is delivered, you take the information of the lecture, right? Like, but that's not how learning works. And that's not how it's worked for a very, very long time, right? And so like education has shifted that. We're more active. We're kind of having ourselves look at students as like active learners, that they're adaptable. We're understanding the fact that not every student learns the same. And so that's kind of, what was kind of needed to be done. Right. And I think like, I think education as a whole has a bad PR problem, because of course people think back to their educations, they were miserable, or they remember the teachers that were bad, the teachers that were mean to them, all of these things. And so I think like it's hard to even just kind of regard that example. And so I know from my thing is, especially if people hear I'm at the university, they talk about these kids these days that they don't know anything. And I'm like, they know a lot, they know a ton, and they kind of understand how the world works. And so for me, I think that's kind of what I keep coming back to is everyone wants to boil it down to a transactional process, and it's not. It's 100% not. And that's what like good learning and good teaching does, is kind of taking away that here's this piece of information, you must memorize it, and now you have it. Instead, it's more active learning. It's learning how things work, learning how things operate. Something I always come back to, I think, in terms of my teaching, especially if I'm teaching like rhetoric or composition, is I always tell my students, you know this already. I'm like, this is something that know, this is something that you do. I'm just making you aware of the tips and tricks about it, right? Like, everyone, when they're writing a paper or having a conversation, uses sources, right? You find yourself, if you're in an argument with somebody, you find yourself talking about Kevin Durant's, points per game, right? Like that, you're using a source, right? You're using statistics. And so it's a lot of those things are just kind of pointing those things out. It's like, well, what makes this more effective? And saying, okay, well, this is how you kind of do these things and present these things. And so, that's something I always try to come back to. And so that's kind of my, I guess, way of battling that, is being very open about how this works, and how these classes operate, and what are kind of moving ourselves away from this memorization. And I hope that as a result of that, you have students leave your class thinking, wow, I learned a lot. I learned about like how process works, or I learned less about, here's the exact piece of information about what like realist literature is, but I kind of learned to appreciate kind of what to look for, and different kind of elements and different thematic schemes for things. And so, I always try to really press that big picture element, as opposed to being like, here's this stuff that I have and I'm giving it to you.
Right.
So it's, I mean, again, that's kind of my own personal crusade and kind of how I operate, but it's hard for me to kind of say like, as a whole, as an education system, this is what we need to do. But I think a lot of it starts with kind of deprogramming what we think education truly is, that it is a commodity, that you kind of learn this information, and when you receive this information, you level up, and you earn, you get an A, right? Like this, you get this. I'm an anti-grading person. I'm more of a grading contract person. So kind of removing that commodification, where it's like, if I do blank, I get this, when that is not how anyone has ever worked, right? So or has ever learned. So that's a personal small crusade. Again, I don't know how we kind of implement that from the top down, but these are kind of little things that I can do.
I couldn't hear the lie in any of that. So it's a good personal crusade.
I hope so.
So tell me a life-altering event that you think would help everyone. And maybe you haven't experienced it. Maybe you have.
Yeah, this is a tough question. So I think for me, the thing I kind of come back to, I came back to it. I thought about this a lot. And so the one thing that the first thing I popped into is I think we mentioned before that I'm a runner. And so I've done long distance races. I've done marathons, half marathons, things along those lines. And I am not a good runner at all. I am an awful, awful runner. But there is something I think like kind of magical about training for a race, and then completing the race, right? And I think that's kind of something that I wish upon that people could do and people could try, because it's like kind of a really wonderful thing to do. But of course, I understand 100% that like this is a kind of an ableist view. Like not everyone can do this. We all have different bodies and ways in which our bodies perform. And so, that I started thinking, I was like, well, I like this idea of training to do something, to accomplish something. So that's one thing I would suggest. First and foremost, I would say, well, if you want, I'm not going to suggest everyone go out there and train and run a marathon, because not everyone is built for that thing. It's kind of a magical experience. But if it's something, if you've been thinking about doing, I would definitely just go for it and learn a training plan. So that's one thing that I think is like a cool experience, and something that I personally very much cherish, are those moments of training and then actually doing a race, traveling someplace to do a race, whether that is, I got to go to Barcelona to run the race. My grandfather founded the Barcelona Marathon, so it's this very kind of spiritual, emotional event for me. And so I always kind of think fondly about that. Yeah, so that project I'm working on and writing about. So the other thing that I think I would say, which is also very much of my ilk, is to collect things. I like collecting things. And so to have something that you're passionate about that you collect. And this could be anything, right? This doesn't have to be an actual like commodity. This can just be, whether it's a traveling to some place, whether it's a small token, whether it's, something that, an experience that you collect. Oh, I want to try this thing, but I find so much joy in kind of a collecting and trying, because that always automatically is built into kind of trying something new or obtaining something new. So for me, I always mention that I am somebody who loves track jackets. So I have an extensive collection of track jackets. It's unfortunate. It's 84 degrees here today, so I'm not wearing.
Yeah, I'm shocked you're not wearing one.
I know. I'm not.
I was a little disappointed.
I'm sorry. I forgot that it was like video, but I am wearing. Of all the things I'm wearing today, I like never wear a t-shirt. But a friend of ours is running for district council in the elections today. So I was standing. We and my wife Tasha were standing out on Queen City and 15th with like a board wearing the Q Chandler t-shirts for District 1. And so, it's an odd thing that I'm wearing today. But I have over 125 track jackets.
That's amazing.
It's wild. I have an entire closet that's dedicated to them. But there's so much joy to me in that. It's like tracking those down and learning the history about them and like trying to find cool ones. Or let's say there's something that is or something that is released, but they released in like 4 different colorways. And I'm like, well, I want all 4. I want all 4 of the colors. And, so I think there's a kind of, I find a lot of joy in those collection things. And the other thing that I find myself is I'm a donut lover. I love donuts. And so I view donuts as a collecting thing. So I'm somebody who's like, I'm going to this place, I'm seeking this thing out, I'm trying this donut to be able to say, oh, I've been there, right? Like, here's this thing that I collect. Here's this thing that I kind of obsess over. Just be able to kind of be like, oh, this is kind of a nice grounding thing. It's something kind of fun for me to think about, to work on. So that's something I find myself enjoying. And so I always try to advise people to like find your own like little thing, right? Whether it's, I was talking to a buddy of mine who's he's a chiropractor. He is my chiropractor. So he was talking to him and he's like, I'm a breakfast burrito guy. He's like, everywhere I go, I try the breakfast burrito. And it's like, and I know that some places are going to have a terrible breakfast burrito, but I still want to like, this is part of it, right? This is part of the quest. This is part of kind of the reasoning for these things. And so I think it's always nice to kind of have that in terms of life. I mean, I think of video games, like it's your side quest. It's always nice to have like this side quest of like, oh, this is how I go about my day. This is what I do. But like, oh, here's this like small interest that I have. So,
is your chiropractor Drew Brooks?
I'm sure he's definitely like cracked my back in old Egan's before, where you've like put your hands on your shoulders and you've got kind of his dad's strength that he's had since he was 5 years old. That he'll be able to kind of do that. But the breakfast burrito, equal opportunity burrito eater, Drew Brooks.
He seems like a breakfast.
I think so
burrito
too.
guy to
No,
me.
absolutely.
I bet he is.
100%. Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just picturing Drew Brooks as my chiropractor. It's pretty funny.
It is a funny picture.
So I think going back to kind of those, I think those small things, they give you lots of experiences, right? It's not just one universal, it's a mosaic of experiences. And so it's like a mosaic of like things that you do, whether it's, you're like, oh, I collect these things, or I hear this place has, whether you're on a road trip, you're like, oh, I want to stop at this place because I hear that this thing is good, or this is something that I've always wanted to check. So it allows you to kind of do those research when you travel and kind of track those things down. So I guess I would say to me that is kind of the thing I continue to come back to, is kind of this collection of things. I
love that, and even not tangible things. That's a great answer. And I will just throw this out there. We talked about running again. I'm trying my best to get back into it now that the pandemic's over. I do a lot of my running in a gym.
Yeah.
That's neither here nor there, but whenever I don't feel like it and it's a day for me to go running, sometimes I will think, but Brian's out there running. So you keep posting that, because if no one else is inspired, sometimes you get me off the couch or out of my bad mood.
Well, thank you. I try. I know. I think that's part of the reason why I do like being so public about it, and I like because for a long time, I mean, it's funny, we talked about persona before. For a long time when I first started, I'd be like, oh, I hate running. Running sucks. This is kind of my running persona. And one time my wife Tasha checked me on. She's like, you're saying this just because that's what people want you to say. You actually like running. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Like, I actually do really enjoy running. And so I kind of got away from that negative correlation of running and was like, hey, I'm out here. Like, I didn't do great, but whatever. And so I think that kind of positivity element kind of goes into it, talking about the reverse of being negative about running, because that's what it expected of you. So I'm glad that positivity kind of came through.
It did. All right, it's our favorite question. It's borrowed from the original Alabama Take podcast, which we hope we can talk Corey out of hiatus at some point. What's done up real good?
What's done up real good? So I thought about this from a philosophical standpoint, and I think what's probably if someone asked you like what's done up real good, and I imagine that you would say, are people familiar with it? It's like you know it when you see it, right? Like that's kind of one of those things where it's like, okay, this is done up real good. For me, I came back to a couple elements, right? So I said, okay, it's something that shows itself as like its self, right? Like it is this thing that is the core of this thing. It cannot be more the thing than it is. And so, but it also exists as its best self, right? So something that is like distilled, something done up real good is like something that has been distilled down to its core, but it's still like maximum, right? Like, so, for me, it's like walking into like an Alabama tailgate that has like the most ridiculous spread you've ever seen in your life, right? And it's not like the spread itself is not like super fancy stuff, but you like walk in and like someone is like mixing yellow hammers. So there's like the massive like tray of pork and like smoked meats and like 12 different types of golden flake potato chips. Like this is, and like the Publix cookie tray. Like this is like you walk in and you're like, this is it. Like this is the moment. This is done up real good to me. So I think of something that is done up real good is like something that is pure, but also exists as a tribute. And so that's something I kind of like come back to, which I think is kind of fun. I was like, oh, it's like, okay, like this is what this exact thing is, but it's also acknowledging a higher concept, right? Like this is as close to the core as possible, but like this is done up real good, right? So like even I think of like, we've obviously being a musician, it's like when you go see like the Glory Fires play, like it is distilled to like a raw element, but it's also all the way maximum. Like, and so it kind of has these two kind of these things playing at the same time. So I kind of find that to be like, it's not extra for extra's sake. It is just what it is. And so that's kind of those moments when I come in and I say that's done up real good. Awesome.
That is so good.
The dichotomy of done up real good.
I was going to jokingly interject when you were talking about how it can be the and also the best, and I was going to say, oh, Alabama football, that's going to be your
no, absolutely, exactly. It's like steeped,
but you were so close,
steeped in tradition, right? And then, but also just like, what the hell's going on, right? Like, still that maximum element where it is kind of has that extraness to it, but you're like, this fits though, like this deserves this like pomp and circumstance, and it's not pomp, I guess, I don't know, but it deserves this kind of like celebration, right?
Yeah. Well, where can folks find you and your work? Do you want to plug a couple of websites?
Yeah, for sure. So the main thing is brianoliu.com. You can find me there. That is where all of my professional work is held. We mentioned my Twitter before. Twitter is kind of the main spot where you can find me hanging out. That is twitter.com/Brian Oliu, OLIU. So yeah, those are kind of the main spots, and you can probably find me, if you can find me on either of those websites, you can find me literally anywhere else. So I'm easy to track down. And then if you want to follow the poems, again, they're Instagram.com/Tiny Tuscaloosa.
Right. And I see a lot of people on Twitter, like almost daily, at least weekly, say, I hate Twitter. I hate coming to Twitter. It's a cesspool. That's the key phrase, cesspool. Follow Brian Oliu, and it won't be, okay?
I will be your spray of like in those science projects where they drop like the Dawn liquid soap and then it like spreads everything out. I will be your Dawn liquid soap in the mire and muck of twitter.com.
There you go. Well, I appreciate your time, man.
I appreciate you.
Thanks for Thanks for bringing the positivity to the online world and the real world, as we've come to find out. That's a real thing for you. As for our viewers, there's more to be found at the Alabama Take website, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Will went walking and was blown away.